Cool. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it. This is the first of 4 sessions associated with the D4 training, Understanding Real Estate Development. So this is a series that is free for participants, and it's sponsored by the Knight Foundation. So we're very grateful for them. The purpose of these trainings is to help citizens understand how to better engage with the real estate development process, right? In one way or another, I know all of us are involved in community development or neighborhood leadership or activism. And so real estate development is something that has direct impact on many of the communities that we care about. So we want to be able to give citizens helpful information to make sure that, community voices are heard and that they can just better understand what is going on in general. We've tried to keep these sessions pretty intimate. We want to make sure that there's a lot of time for questions and answers, a lot of time for dialogue. So we have been inviting D4 partners, friends, board members, as well as graduates of the Civic Leadership Institute. So I know a number of us on the call went through that previous training. So we're really happy to bring you back and continue providing you what information we can. So before getting into, introducing our amazing speaker, so excited to have her, I'm hoping that we can do a brief round of introductions. And I'll quickly start by asking Francis and Samantha to introduce themselves, but I also recognize that I haven't introduced myself yet. So in case you don't know, my name is Sam Butler, and I am the Executive Director of Doing Development Differently in Metro Detroit, D4. And yeah, just really excited to be here. And I'll kick it off to Francis and Samantha.
Thanks, Sam. My name is Francis Grunow. I'm the Director of Policy and Education, and was the wrangler of this project along with Sam and Samantha in terms of putting together the sessions and the speakers. And we're very excited to have everybody here today for the first one. We had initially planned this months and months and months ago to be a real thing, in person. And of course, COVID has impacted all of us in so many different ways. So we're very happy to have you here virtually. And I will kick it off to Samantha. And if Samantha, you can choose the next person and go from there, just your name and an organization, and anything else briefly you want to share.
Well, yeah. So, I think if helpful, I can go down the
Sam,
list.
you can be the MC on that. Great.
Yep.
Hi, everyone. I'm Samantha Maruli. I'm D4's intern this semester, and I'm also tech support for these training sessions. So if you have any issues as we go along through this meeting, feel free to send me a message in the chat. I'll probably send a phone number you can contact me at through the chat as well, in case something happens and you drop off the call.
Yeah, great. So like I said, we want this to be a really intimate conversation today. So I'm going to ask everyone to introduce themselves. I'll read off names, and let's try to keep it short, but I might ask for you to give us your name, if there is an organization that you want to claim as being affiliated with, and third, if you don't mind, how you heard about this training. So the first person on my list is, it looks like Adriana from Class Act Detroit.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, so I'm Adriana with Class Act Detroit. What we do is we provide arts education programming for the youth of Detroit. So we do beat making, dance, podcasting, and that type of thing. We heard about you guys through MCR because we got a grant from the Kresge Foundation for, capacity, because we are looking to create a hip hop cultural hub for our community. So it'll be centered around, hip hop culture and just creating community and bringing people together.
Fantastic. Welcome, Adriana.
Thank you.
Anna Haas is next on the list.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna. I'm an intern with Norristown CDC, and I just started in September. So I heard about this training through my mentor, which is Patricia Bosch, who's also on this call, I believe. And she just thought this would be a great way for me to kind of get an intro to a lot of the community development stuff that Norristown does. So I'm really excited.
Fantastic. Welcome, Anna. Corey Leon, who almost needs no introduction, but we'll let him introduce himself anyway. Corey, are you there? We can come back to Corey. Like I said, he almost needs no introduction, and apparently he agrees.
No, of course, my phone would not let me fingerprint log in. I had to log in with my password. It always happens at the most inopportune times.
Of course, yeah. Well, I timed it that way, obviously.
Yeah. So, I'm Corey Leon with the National Development Council. We're a national nonprofit that assists communities and other nonprofits with creating homes, creating jobs, and doing community projects. So my specialty is real estate financing, and my subspecialty is historic tax credits. But I do a lot with low-income housing tax credits and other affordable housing programs.
Great. And I should also plug that Corey is our speaker for the October 28th training, which is all about where does development happen and why does it happen there. So we hope you all can join us for that. So I'm going to keep moving down the list. I might ask everyone to speed up and to shorten their introductions if we can. Just
Sorry about that.
No. Next, I have Dan Comer.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Dan Comer. I'm grateful to be here this morning. I'm grateful you're all here. Thanks, D4, for putting this together. I work with Bridging Communities. We're a nonprofit community development organization in Southwest Detroit. I lead our neighborhood stabilization and housing efforts. And I heard about these conversations by email through D4 as I sit on the work table that we have.
Great. D4 board member David Dobie.
Hey everybody, as Sam said, I'm on the D4 board. I work for the American Federation of Teachers of Michigan, and also serve on the board of the Cass Corridor Neighborhood Development Corporation.
Great, thanks Dave. David Palmer. We have a string of Daves coming up, just so you know. Yeah.
Call me David too. David Palmer, I'm an independent workforce and nonprofit consultant, certified through COACT Detroit to do consulting with nonprofits through COACT and the Wilson Foundation. I'm also a real estate broker. I have an associate broker's license. I've mainly focused on residential real estate, but I'm working on a research project for first-time homebuyer education. There are 16 different HUD agencies in the city of Detroit that are certified to do first-time homebuyer and foreclosure prevention. And I can't figure out what they do because HUD doesn't report on their efficacy, impact, or other reasonable stats. So digging into those numbers.
Great, thanks David. And now we have David Reynolds.
Hi, I'm David Reynolds. I'm a D4 board member, and I also teach state and local government at Eastern Michigan University.
Yeah, a D4 founding board member, I believe. Yeah. Ernest Little.
I'm Ernest Little. I'm the president of 3rd Precinct Police Community Relations. I'm an associate broker at Cosmopolitan Real Estate. I'm a former housing inspector for the city of Detroit for over 26 years.
Great, thank you. Next we have Gabby Santiago Romero.
Good morning, folks. This is Gabby. I'm with We the People Michigan. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the policy and research director there. Super excited to be here. I'm also a D4 leadership alum. So super excited to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabby. Next on the list, we have Mr. Moses, who I know you introduced yourself briefly, but if you just want to do it again.
Yes, I'm Irving Moses. I live in Houston, Texas. I am a former real estate broker, and I've had about 35 years working in commercial real estate, assisting all kinds of clients and developers to purchase land. I'm currently working with a group in Atlanta on a historic Black college campus, Morris Brown College, where we have a development team that's looking at a rehabilitation plan for this national landmark. So that's a little bit of my experience.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Moses. And then Janelle Bulat. Apologies if I mispronounced her last name.
No worries, Bulat. Good morning. I work for this morning's speaker, Tanya Stapleton at Parkstone Development Partners. I'm sure she'll talk a little bit more about what we do, but glad to be here.
Great. Thanks, Janelle. Jolitha Goodwin.
Yes, good morning. My name is Jolitha Goodwin. I am I had my introduction together. I am a Friends of Parkside residents, and I was introduced to you guys through Zach Rowe. Zach is the director of Friends of Parkside.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for joining us. Next up, Kat J.
Hi, I'm a realtor as well as a new investor. I have done some investing in commercial real estate. I'm sorry, in residential real estate, but looking forward to going over into the commercial side of things. Really happy to be here, keeping it very short, so peace talk.
Great. Thank you. And welcome. Next, we have Katrina Watkins. Katrina, are you there? We can come back to Katrina. Next, we have Pastor Forsyth, D4 board member.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Louis Forsyth. I serve as the senior pastor of Pleasant Grove Baptist Church, which is located on the near east side of the city. And I am also a member of D4 board of directors.
Thanks, Pastor Forsyth. Welcome. Next up, and we're nearing the end of the list here, we have Nicholas Trepanier. Sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Hi, that's okay. My name is Nick. I am from Brilliant Detroit. I was recommended to come and join this webinar to understand a little bit more about real estate development in terms of as we grow with new facilities and things like that. I work on the operations team in developing our new facilities.
Great. Welcome, Nick. Thanks for joining us. And then Pat Bosch. Pat, are you there? Well, Pat Bosch, I know, is the executive director of Northtown CDC and is pretty active with our community and labor roundtable. So welcome, Pat.
Thank you.
Pat, was there anything else you wanted to add?
I found out about the meeting via email and D4 meetings. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Next, we have Tiff Massey.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tiff Massey. I'm an interdisciplinary artist based in Detroit, and I'm currently doing development. And so it'd be nice to know more about what I'm getting into, especially because I think I'll be doing this for the next 5 to 10 years.
Great. Welcome. Welcome, Tiff. And last, but certainly not least on the list, we have D4 board president, Tenise Hill.
Thank you, Sam. Welcome, everyone. I'm happy that everybody's here and hope we get a lot out of this. And let's get started.
Yeah. I know we skipped over Miss Katrina Watkins. Katrina, I don't know, are you able to mute yourself? Did you want to introduce? That's okay. That's all right. So yeah, like I said, we wanted this to be a smaller conversation. We've built in a lot of time for dialogue and to help us think about how to manage this crazy thing called Zoom. I'm going to kick it off to Francis with some Zoom tips and ground rules.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, there's a slide. Oops, I think I went one too many. There we go. Zoom tips. Oh, I need some Zoom tips apparently. This is all stuff that you probably know very well by now, and just going over a couple of quick tips to remind you. Make sure that you're muted when you're not speaking. It just helps us cut out the background noise, and make sure that you unmute yourself when you're asking a question. As Sam mentioned, we definitely want this to be as interactive as Zoom can make it. So also turn on and off your video. It's great to see people's faces when they're speaking, but we realize that that's not always possible. So just be aware of that. Those buttons are on your bottom left. You can change your display name. That was something I learned fairly recently, actually, in the last month or two, that you can change the way your name shows up. If you hover over your participant list and your face or name, if you press that that blue box with the 3 white dots in it, you can change it. Or on the participant list itself, you can hover over your name and rename yourself. And you can customize your view settings. That's the button in the top right, where you can change how the display looks and the presentation looks. So change that around per your liking. You can react. So if you like something you're hearing or want to clap or raise your hand or whatever, there are buttons at the bottom called reaction buttons that are happy to have you use and for folks to see. And then in terms of how this meeting can work better in terms of interaction, we're going to try to keep a track of people raising their hand. You can raise your hand using that button on the participants box. If you're on the telephone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9. And then if you can't use your mouse for some reason and want to use your keyboard, if you're on Windows, it's Alt-Y or Option-Y, and that way we'll see you raise your hand and make sure we don't miss you. You can virtually sign in just so we have a record of who's here, and especially if your name isn't how you'd like it to appear, if you're using someone else's account, you can type in your first and last name in your video feed. And we did intros, but it's always good to just announce yourself when we're doing the Q&A. That will help us know who's speaking. That's just a few points, and we look forward to taking Zoom with us all through these sessions. Again, not ideal, but we're grateful you're here. So I'll pass it back to Sam as he introduces our speaker.
Yeah, thanks, Francis. One last housekeeping note. I just want to make sure everyone is aware that we are recording this session, and we do intend to probably publish this online at some point, because we want to make sure that we're sharing this information with everyone else. So if if for some reason you have questions about how we're sharing it, or if you have concerns, please don't hesitate to contact me, or I think Samantha put her phone number in the chat box as well. So yeah, and you can do that, after the session if you'd like. Okay, so now that we've sort of made it through all that preamble, I have the great pleasure of introducing today's session and our speaker. So, today we really want to educate, citizens, community developers on the development process as a whole. So I think the session today is going to go over the various departments, what are the various roles and rights that the city has, developers have, and citizens and residents have in engaging the development process, and really just sort of like going over how residents can engage and navigate this whole process. And giving that presentation today, we have Tanya Stapleton from Parkstone Development Partners, who I do have to say, I will just gush that she is able to join us today, because she, in my opinion, is really one of the most knowledgeable people about Detroit's development process. So Tanya is a zoning and land use expert with over 20 years of experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, most recently serving as the zoning administrator for the city of Detroit. Her core strengths include strategic and master planning, project management, land entitlements, and commercial development. She helped to launch over 80 small businesses, co-authored several ordinances for municipalities, and is the founder of Parkstone Development Partners. Tanya has a degree in urban and regional planning from Michigan State University and is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you so much, Sam. I have to say, when I was first asked to speak, I had to tell Francis and Sam, remind them that I actually speak about zoning, and not everybody finds zoning as fascinating as I do. So you guys will have to bear with me if I nerd out a little bit here this morning, but I'm very excited to be with you. Thank you for those introductions. It reminded me of organizations I've worked with in the past, and what a vital role nonprofits play in the development process. As Sam mentioned, our firm, Parkstone Development Partners, we assist developers with obtaining land use entitlements, and that is just a fancy word for government approvals for development. And right now I'm going to share my screen, and let's see. Oh, that's the end of the presentation. I have to go back to the beginning. Sorry, I wasn't queued up properly. Okay. As mentioned, land use entitlements are basically just legal rights that are conveyed by a government for the purpose of development. And they come in several different categories: legal, financial, environmental, there's civil engineering entitlements. But what we're going to talk about today is mainly land use entitlements, or what we commonly refer to as zoning. And I want to give you an overview of where zoning comes from. Zoning is a police power, and which means that it is it's constitutional authority that's granted to states for the purpose of protecting health, safety, and general welfare of the public. And so here in Detroit, the place we go to understand zoning, of course, is our zoning ordinance. And the zoning ordinance must comply with the master plan. So if a developer is coming in to rezone some land in your community, or to seek a special land use approval, that proposal has to align with the master plan, which is like a long-term future land use guide. That, of course, gets its authority from a state enabling act, mainly planning, the Planning Enabling Act and the Zoning Enabling Act. And those are important because they dictate what municipalities can legally do to regulate development in their communities. And then lastly, these are all rights from the Constitution that protect due process and free speech. There's case law that could impact development in our communities. An example of how case law might impact development is the Bolt case. And you may have heard about Bolt versus City of Lansing. That is a case in which the drainage fee was deemed an unlawful tax because it didn't obtain voter approval. And so there's currently cases being adjudicated for the related to the Detroit drainage fee, and whether that will impact, that case law will impact those outcomes. But ultimately, all land uses are adjudicated in circuit court. So that may or may not be relevant to you, but just wanted to set the stage for the presentation, and knowing that the whole purpose of land use controls is to protect the property rights of the landowner and surrounding residents, as well as enable municipalities to plan for development. So here's a few terms I'd like to go over. The first is legal land use, and that sounds pretty basic. However, when someone says to you that their parcel is zoned for a hotel, for example, they're not talking about R2 or B4, the actual zoning district. What they mean is that that is the current legal land use, that was the last permitted use. And those land uses get vested into the property. And it's still, if they don't have a current legal land use, then there's still quite a lengthy process that you have to go through to get your land use approved. The next term is variance, and basically a variance is a waiver or the ability to grant relief from meeting any type of zoning requirement. Variances are granted by the Board of Zoning Appeals, and generally you have to prove to the Board of Zoning Appeals that there's some reason why your project cannot comply with the letter of the law. There has to be some type of unique circumstance. And then lastly, I mentioned due process, and due process just ensures that development is a fair and equitable process for all involved. And there's an opportunity for appeal on both the side of the developer and the community. And what I mean by that is that if a project is denied for whatever reason, the developer has an opportunity to seek appeal. They have an opportunity for a fair hearing. The city couldn't come in and say, we don't really like your project. We don't like the design. We're not even going to give you a hearing. We're not even going to let you go to City Planning Commission or City Council. So that would be a violation of due process. Likewise, if something is approved by City Planning Commission or Board of Zoning Appeals, residents have an opportunity to appeal that. And then lastly, the term legal non-conforming use, that can sometimes be the bane of the local community. That is a use that was established prior to the zoning changing. So it might be, for example, a commercial use in a residential area, and that use is what we call, it's grandfathered in. They still have some type of land use rights to continue that use. Non-conforming uses can't be expanded or enlarged or altered without permission of the Board of Zoning Appeals. So that's the other function of that body. So it's very important to remember with vested land use rights that local government cannot take away those rights from the property owners. They're barred from enacting any type of ordinance that prohibits the continuation of the non-conforming use. So I'm going to give you a couple examples that will help you understand some of these legal terms before we jump into the overall development process. This is a project that we assisted with in West Village, 7941 Agnes. It is zoned residential, and it was used previously for residential. And the developer came to us and wanted assistance with rezoning this property. He wanted to rezone it to for use as a commercial, some type of commercial use or retail use. And as you can see, the architecture gave us clues that it was previously some type of non-residential use, most likely a storefront. These are very common in our neighborhoods where the store owner lived above his or her business. And so the first thing that we did is we requested a zoning verification letter because we wanted to determine what the current legal land use was. And sure enough, we were able to find a permit, and there's a copy of that there on the screen, dating back to May of 1921. And the use that was established was retail sales and service. And so we were able to determine that they could pull an alterations permit and reestablish this use without a need to go to the BZA. Worst case scenario, the building department could have interpreted that as requiring a BZA hearing, which is definitely a much easier process than rezoning. I would like to point out, if this developer wanted to do a coffee shop, for example, or something other than retail, that would not be allowed. That would require a public hearing before the Board of Zoning Appeals to alter or change that original non-conforming use. The next example is AGI Construction. This is in Southwest Detroit. This was actually a Motor City Match project that we worked on. And unlike the previous example, this looks like a very typical residential use. It had been used as a residence for many years. And it was purchased by this design build firm that had outgrown their location in a business incubator and wanted their own office. So this was a really fun project to work on. They also came to us and requested a rezoning. And I'd like to point out that rezonings generally happen on a much larger scale. Keep in mind, they have to comply with the master plan. So when there's a changing neighborhood or changing neighborhood conditions, you might upzone or downzone. Sometimes an entire neighborhood or a street or block, but spot zoning is not a best practice. In some cases, spot zoning is illegal. So rezoning a single parcel would not be the appropriate route to go. However, we did some history, we did a little bit of research and found out there was some case history before the Board of Zoning Appeals, dating back to 1945, and there was a 1948 case. And we looked at the historic permits, and we found uses in this building for confectionery store, TV sales and service, an eyeglass store, and an ice house. I think the ice house was the oldest permit. So we knew it had been previously used for a commercial use. And the question was then, would the BZA deem it appropriate to reestablish a non-conforming use at this location? This project, community engagement was really important. It was going to really determine how the community felt about this use. And here's a basic site plan. Here's the house here where the design build firm was seeking to locate. They only have 3 employees, which worked really well for us. Most of the employees are out in the field doing construction. So we're just talking about the office employees. You can notice that there's absolutely no parking on the site other than, I mean, I guess the garage parking. So we also needed a parking variance. So we were able to seek the land use and the parking in a single BZA hearing. In this case, across the street is a park, Stanton Park, and there's on-street parking on Porter and 18th Street. So anybody who would be working at this business could park along Porter Street without impacting residents. And in general, parking variances can be hard to obtain because folks don't like businesses patrons to businesses parking in front of their house. And so we knew that wasn't going to be an issue here. Like the idea that it's a corner lot. And so a lot of times around a park like this, you might do a rezoning of parcels that abut the park. But in this case, as I mentioned, it's just a single parcel. The other thing that was interesting about this case is to the south on 18th Street, right in the middle of the block, was another legal non-conforming use, and that was manufacturing use that was open and operating with little incidents to the surrounding property. So establishing an office use was seen as much less intensive than the minor or the small manufacturing. So the client in this case, AGI Construction, did all of the community engagement, and the Board of Zoning Appeals ultimately granted approval of this project. So before we go on to diving into the development process, I just wanted to know at this point if there's any questions about zoning in general, why we do it, or anything that I've shared so far. And I don't know, Sam, if you, I don't have access to anyone who might be raising their hand, but if there's no questions, I will continue.
Well, I mean, I have a quick question, Tanya. You know, certainly I know spot zoning is frowned upon, but under what circumstances is spot zoning deemed illegal, and how, like, and who deems it illegal in that instance? And if you don't mind, maybe like go over quickly, what is spot zoning for, in case somebody doesn't know that term?
So yeah, so spot zoning basically is rezoning a single parcel for a specific developer. And the reason why it is oftentimes deemed illegal is that master plans are larger frameworks. And I mentioned that zoning needs to comply with the master plan. So if a neighborhood, the future land use plan is residential, and you're taking one parcel and rezoning it for a non-residential use, then that would be contrary to the master plan. So in the purest sense of land use administration, it would be illegal. However, municipalities all interpret that differently. And in Detroit, it's kind of a case-by-case basis. We've seen spot zoning approved by city council in very unique circumstances. But in general, as a professional planner, I wouldn't suggest spot zoning because it's not the best land use practice. If that answers your question.
No, that's perfect. And I think David Palmer raised his hand.
Thank you for all this information. I'm wondering if there are timelines associated with these variances and exceptions that are made, like specifically with the AGI project. I mean, that building's essentially been vacant for the 4 years that I've been keeping track of it. And there's really no progress that can be seen externally that's been made on the property. So can it sit like that in perpetuity until they get around to it? Or is there another timeline that's associated with trying to actually get it done?
That is a very good question. So there are specific timelines that need to be met. In the case of any type of zoning grant, whether it's from the building department or the Board of Zoning Appeals, permits have to be pulled within 6 months of that zoning approval, or the zoning approval can expire. There are allowances to pay a fee and get your grant extended up to a year in order to pull permits. But once the permit is issued, that zoning is kind of locked in. Then the Michigan Building Code takes over. The Michigan Building Code also has sort of a 6-month time frame, in that you have to you don't complete the construction within 6 months, but 6 months of non-activity would give the municipality the authority to cancel a permit. Generally, what a contractor would do is call for a special inspection. Whenever you call for an inspection, your 6 months starts over. So there oftentimes when there's delays, and I don't know with AGI if they have pulled their permits or not, or if they got an extension. So things are so difficult right now during the pandemic in getting some of these projects moving forward. But once they do pull the permit, they will have time to continue the construction as long as they're making progress.
Yeah, certainly good information for, you know, the many communities that are dealing with like vacant structures in their neighborhood.
Yes.
I think Gabby raised her hand.
Yeah, quick question. Thanks, Tanya, so much. This is really interesting. I have, I think, some stupid questions. You mentioned there's a master plan. Where is this plan? Can we find this plan? And do we have a say in it at all? Can we get on top of that plan at all?
Very good question. The master plan is actually online. I don't know if the maps themselves are online, but the framework is. The master plan, the keepers of the master plan are planning and development, and I'm going to go into that a little bit more in the next section of the presentation. But the master plan, I will say, in Detroit is in desperate need of updating. Currently, or over the last couple of years, the Planning and Development Department has embarked on these neighborhood level plans. The neighborhood level plans do not have any legal authority, unfortunately. So for me as a planner, it's discouraging because I know residents put a lot of time into working with the planners to create a neighborhood plan, but unless it's codified, it really doesn't have any teeth. So the next step that the city needs to do is sort of bring those recommendations from those planning studies into the zoning ordinance and master plan in order to really affect development in the future. That's a great question. Thank you, Gabby.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
And I think, I mean, that is something that trips up a lot of community groups, that relationship between the master plan and zoning. I think we even saw it yesterday as City Council was approving the change to the master plan for the State Fairgrounds site. But then a lot of community residents just weren't understanding the ramifications of that and confusing it with the zoning, right? And so, yeah, the zoning code is like really what dictates the use. Is that fair, Tanya? Okay.
Yes. Yep. And we're going to talk about a case study here in a bit, which will explain that a little bit better.
Perfect. And then I just want to make sure we highlight Dan's question, which is, can you share the legal framework or requirements for an intervention to a vacated street? So I don't know if that's something you want to do now or later in your talk.
I think I would rather go into that when we talk about DPW.
Okay, Dan, you good with that?
Remind me to go, if I don't go back, remind me to address that. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move forward. So the question that I get asked probably more than any other question, I've been asked to participate in committees, to map the process. Everybody wants to know what is the process and how long it takes. And so what I'd like to do today is to tell you, you can't map the process. The process is different for almost every project. The two examples that I just gave you were very similar, and yet even those took two different paths of approval. And so the larger the development, of course, the more moving pieces. And so the best thing you can do as a developer or a resident that's involved in the development process is to understand all the potential approvals that you need, all the departments that you would interact with and what their role is. And like I mentioned, what authority they have or don't have in your process. So some of the things that would dictate your path to approval would be, of course, your proposed use, the existing zoning, if there's any type of overlay districts, and the size of the parcel, what type of street it's located on, whether it's a major street, a trunk line, all of those would play a role. And so much of what's in the zoning ordinance is circumstantial. So let's keep that in mind as we move through this overview. So I'd like to just briefly talk about the different departments that are involved in development. The city has done a great job in trying to create a one point of contact. They recently launched the Development Resource Center, and that's sort of a starting point for your project where you can get information about all the various approvals that are needed and departments. And they've also gone to an electronic plan review process, which is so helpful in that when you submit your project for approval, it gets automatically electronically routed to all the various departments that may need to look at it. However, that makes a lot of sense when you're submitting your construction drawings, but so much of what we're talking about today happens in pre-development. So those are some of the things I'd like to talk about. The most obvious is planning and development. And as was mentioned, they are the keepers of the master plan. They are responsible for updating it and interpreting it. They also do the neighborhood studies, planning studies at the neighborhood level. And they also oversee design review. And I'm going to talk about design review a little bit more later. Housing and resource development. This is a new department that was created in the Duggan administration. And it basically, some of the processes that were under planning were pulled out, and this new department was created. They administer housing programs, community development block grant funds. They're much more administrative than planning. They issue RFPs. They work closely with the land bank and MISHDA. So mainly on housing, but also get involved in other types of land use administration. The City Planning Commission, they're the legislative branch of planning. They report up to City Council. City Planning Commission is responsible for writing all the ordinances and reviewing rezonings. So they're the policy arm for the city. If your project is going for a rezoning, you will work closely with their staff. Jobs and economy team, the JET team is not really a department. It's a group within the mayor's office that facilitates development on behalf of the administration, particularly special projects. And so, as I mentioned, it's not a department per se, but they interface and coordinate with all city departments on economic development initiatives. Building Safety, Engineering, and Environmental Department. That's actually a department that I was housed in when I was the zoning manager. The reason for that, people might think, why are you planners in BSEED? BSEED actually has the authority, and that's through our city charter, to administer and interpret the zoning ordinance. So they review plans for compliance with zoning, issue permits, and they also do all the land use enforcement through annual inspections, tickets, and whatnot. There's a few other departments that are involved in development that we interact with on behalf of our clients on a daily basis. One is the city assessor. So for doing any type of land assembly, lot splits, lot combination, condo subdivisions, we would be working with the city assessor and they would approve those items. DPW, and there was a question about, I think it was a right-of-way vacation. They would process that and we would petition the city, petition city council to vacate a right-of-way. And basically what that means is if there's a street or an alley that's going through a development and a developer might own property on all sides, you can vacate that and it becomes part of, you can combine it as part of your parcel. There's usually utilities in the right of way, so there's easements we have to deal with or possibly reroute utilities. But that is a very common practice in this pre-development stage. They also would grant any type of easements or encroachments into the public right of way. They would approve closing streets during construction, for example, or closing sidewalks during construction. That would all be a permit that's issued by DPW. The law department is intimately involved in development, but they are very behind the scenes. So you may or may not interact directly with them. They approve all of the ordinances and resolutions. They approve that language for all the city council actions that a developer is going to need. They advise BZA and the building department on hearings and adjudicating those hearings. They assist with writing zoning ordinances and most importantly, they defend the land use decisions. So there's probably more residents than developers on in this meeting. So To go back to the example, if a community organization wants to appeal an approval, a land use approval, and you appeal it to circuit court, the law department would defend that decision and state the case of why the city made the right decision. So that's, those are all departments that interact. And I just realized I didn't include the fire department. The fire department has a plan review. The fire marshal's division has a plan review division that reviews all site plans, and there's different things that they're looking for as far as emergency access to a site, location of fire hydrants, things like that. So I'd like to jump into some of the zoning terms. When we talk about a rezoning, basically we're talking about a map amendment. So the image there is a typical zoning map. They're usually color coded. And red and orange is a commercial district, usually yellow and is residential and whatnot. So if you were going to rezone a piece of property, say we're looking at this parcel here, what we're really petitioning the city for is a map amendment. We want the zoning to change. There's also text amendments, and these are pretty rare. If there's something that is not allowed in the zoning ordinance, you could petition the city to change the text of that regulation. And actually the example that the case study that we're going to look at today, there is a text amendment involved. Special land use, that is a conditional, it's also referred to as a conditional land use. So if there is a use there's three types of uses that are permitted by right, uses that are permitted only after a land use hearing, and then of course uses that are prohibited. So a special land use is a process administered by the building department, and you may or may not need that for your project. Another term that you'll hear is preliminary plan review. That is a service really that's offered by the Development Resource Center, where your team can bring a project in, and there's representatives from all the various city departments are invited to that meeting, and they can give you preliminary feedback, code consultation, just kind of high level direction. And those are really valuable before you finalize your site plan. So we often will schedule those on behalf of developers. And then lastly, site plan review. Site plan review is one of those mandated requirements from the State Enabling Act. So anything that requires special land use approval or new construction would require site plan review. So here's an example of what I was just saying. This is right from our zoning ordinance. You can see the use category is hospital, and those are all the zoning districts laid out there in Detroit. The where there's an R, that use would be permitted by right, which means no special approvals or hearings are required. If there is a C, that would require a hearing in order to, before it can be considered for approval. If it is blank, that means that use is prohibited in that district. And so in addition to the use, zoning ordinance regulates various items such as mass, scale, parking, site amenities. Those are all prescribed in the zoning ordinance. And so oftentimes in order to get approval for a project, you may need a variance or relief from some of these standards. And here's an example of some of the types of variance that developers may need to seek. So as a resident, if you were to get a public notice saying ABC company is requesting a parking variance, and your neighborhood already has a challenged parking situation, you might want to attend that hearing and find out exactly what is going on and whether you as a community are going to support that variance. The B seat, I just want to point out, building department also has the ability to grant administrative waivers for projects that are minimally deficient, 10% or less in any of these dimensional requirements. So just to shift gears here, I'd like to talk about what do we mean when we say our project has been approved. There's 5 main categories of approval. And I would like to say every single one of them is cause for celebration. Development is not an easy process in any city. There's lots of checks and balances and lots of entitlements that to be obtained. And so when you say a project has been approved, it could mean a number of different things. So just like to quickly go through some of these. First is a land sale. If there's any city-owned property involved, then that needs to be approved by the city council. Generally, the city will issue a request for proposal, and that is when the planning department will decide how they want that property developed, and in the RFP, they will list exactly what they're looking for, and then bids will come in from developers and the project is granted. Whenever there is public property involved, there's a development agreement. And so that development agreement is negotiated and signed, and the developer has to meet the terms of that development agreement in order to finalize the transaction, which is ultimately receiving the deed. Concept plan review. Concept plan review is conducted by the Planning and Development Department. Basically, it is design review. And there are a few scenarios where design review is mandated. Traditionally, it was only when you were using city-owned property or incentives. And we'll get into that in a minute. And so what they have the ability to do is kind of review your building materials, window placement, anything that's related to architectural design. That's normally done on a staff level. And if you're in an overlay district, such as the traditional Main Street overlay, there are specific design guidelines in the zoning ordinance that your architect would have to comply with. If you are in a planned development, a PD district, or public center adjacent, you also are subject to design review. Planned developments, of course, are administered through City Planning Commission because they oversee rezonings. Historic district would trigger design review. And as mentioned, the land sales incentives or CBO. The problem with design review is that it's not codified. With the exception of the TMSO, design guidelines are very subjective. And so you have a challenge where it might be one city employee, one city planner who has very strong ideas about what your building should look like. And the question is, that's why it's important to know what authority the city has and what authority the developer has. And ultimately, in a development project, as consultants, that's where the community plays a very important role. We've had situations where the city wanted to see something and the residents wanted something different. And really the residents have more say in the situation than the city. So there is ordinance justification for it in the section of ordinance that provides for concept plan review. And in this community benefits ordinance, there's also some language that allows the city to mitigate negative impacts and to require developer commitments. So the city has used that ordinance to justify design review in some cases. I'm not trying to scare you away from design review because ultimately it is a very good thing that the Planning and Development Department has really raised the bar in Detroit for design excellence. And it was much needed for many years. It was kind of the Wild West, and people built whatever they wanted to build. And the design standard in Detroit was much lower than that in suburban communities. So I will say this is trending in a very positive direction. We just, as a zoning person, I would like to see a lot more of it codified and in our code so that people know what to expect when you're going through the development process. There's not so many unknowns. So the next type of approval isn't an entitlement per se. It's not something that's granted by the municipality, but it is certainly a very important part of the development process, and that is community approval. Very strong history of community engagement in the city of Detroit, and that goes back to the days of urban renewal, believe it or not. Under urban renewal, by law, the Citizens District Council had to approve developments before they would go forward. So the residents had that authority that's normally vested in the government. The Citizen District Councils had that authority. So those don't exist anymore. However, there's very active community organizations, very engaged in development process. And we start right away with community engagement on behalf of our clients. And the most important thing is communicating to the residents what is being proposed. Keep communication open and get their feedback on throughout the entire process. You can't always influence the use per se, but a lot of the development amenities can be dictated to by what the community wants or needs. Of course, we have a community benefits ordinance that is triggered for large developments, and most of the projects we work on don't meet that threshold, but it has kind of a trickle-down effect for development in that there's an expectation for community engagement at all levels, whether the ordinance applies or not. So I just want to stress that the importance of early on figuring out a strategy to address it. And there's a couple of things I want to caution regarding community engagement. It's important to understand the development process, and particularly in this pre-development stage where a project might be going for a rezoning. At that stage, it's very much in concept form. And so a developer might not know, for example, the unit mix for housing, or what the rents will be, or what the sale prices would, sale points would be. That doesn't mean that they're being cagey or withholding information. It's just so early in the process. And you'll see when in future sessions, when we get into developing the pro forma and making the numbers work, the financing hasn't been approved yet. And so the project will evolve through the pre-development stage, and it's very difficult to make commitments. When we get into a community benefits ordinance at a smaller scale, that's even more difficult. One of the things that one of the challenges we have is, how do we ensure equity in the development process when the developer has a role that's not going to continue? And what I mean by that is, we just did a rezoning, for example, for Jefferson School in Midtown, and it is going to be a office incubators, office space, community space. And there's going to be small businesses that will eventually be tenants. One of the things the residents wanted to know is what is going to be the tenant mix, what they wanted to ensure that the jobs were going to be for Detroiters, for people of color. And as a developer, if you rent a floor to an accounting firm, for example, a developer does not have control over who that accounting firm hires. certainly when you're recruiting the types of firms, the focus in that particular project are community-based organizations. So to create sort of synergy amongst the tenants, that's the goal. But to sign any type of ordinance committing to jobs is very, very challenging at this early development phase. So just want you to keep that in mind. That understanding that will mitigate a lot of potential conflicts between developers and community organizations going forward. As mentioned, one of the approvals that we would seek from the city would be any financial incentives. Those are all administered through the city, and future presenters will speak to those. Looking forward to hearing Corey Leon's presentation in that regard. This is the one area of development that Parkstone does not touch at all. So we leave that to much smarter people to navigate the process. But the last one, of course, are legal or land use approvals, which is basically zoning. And so this is kind of where our sweet spot is. And I'm going to just do a very high level walkthrough of some of the steps. Again, not trying to create any kind of process flow, because a process flow does not exist. First of all, if there is any type of zoning change needed, the first step would be to apply for rezoning. Site plan review, as I mentioned, is required for nearly all new developments. You may need a special land use grant. Right now for development, multifamily housing is a conditional use in quite a few districts, as is loft conversion. So that might be the only scenario where a developer would be seeking a special land use grant. Normally, special land uses are requested by the tenants or the specific small business that's operating. We might need a BZA variance. We already talked about what that is. And then ultimately, you are going to be submitting your construction drawings for plan review or a building permit. And then the building permit feels like a very important finish line, but ultimately the finish line is a certificate of occupancy. That's when the land use is legally established. So this entire process, depending on all those factors that we talked about, it could be anywhere from a 6-month process to a 2-year process. So development takes time. So I'd like to move into, Sam, how are we doing on time?
Yeah, no, I think we're doing okay. We got plenty of time.
Okay, very good. So I'd like to look at a project that our firm is working on right now, and kind of go through how we interacted with all of those various departments through the development process. And this, we're still in the middle of it. So some of the things I cannot share, but this is a really relevant case study. This site is vacant. So the current legal land use would be vacant land, because the last permit was a demolition permit. It's zoned R5 and it's about 13 acres. Our client came to us seeking to develop an office building, and because of the size of the parcel, they thought they probably would want to build 2 office buildings, one for a possible government tenant and one they were going to build on spec, which means they don't know who's going to lease it. They're going to build it out and market that office space. Of course, that was prior to COVID. I know office space is not as much demand now, but that was the proposal presented to us. And they also were proposing approximately 10,000 square feet of retail, and which we would refer to as an outlot, but that would front the major thoroughfare that is to the south of this parcel. The retail would belong here. As you can see, the site is completely surrounded by single-family residential with the exception of a church here. So just a fantastic development parcel and lots of opportunity there. Some of the concerns, I'd like to just walk through what we did initially. First step is we looked at a concept plan, and these might as well be Legos at this point. We laid out approximately what the needs were, the civil engineers did, and this is for discussion purposes only. This would be something that we would take to a PPR, for example, to various departments to say, hey, is this going to work? What are some of the approvals that we need? And our first step is we went to the City Planning Commission. This is all one parcel, as mentioned. It was zoned R5, and R5 does not allow office or retail in this manner. So we knew we needed a rezoning. And these were some of our options. As you can see, R5 does allow some office. It allows it if it's in an existing building in less than 3,000 square feet. So that doesn't apply. B1 allows office by right, but it does not allow retail. Retail must be within an office building. And so that would allow for, or multifamily housing, an apartment building that had a small sundry shop or coffee shop, that would be allowed. So B1 works for office, not for retail. B4 works for both. And so in this case, we knew that there is a potential government service use that is actually different than office. It's classified differently, has differently requirements. So we wanted to make sure that that would be allowed if they actually signed a deal with that tenant. And then we wanted maximum flexibility for the retail. And so if they were to recruit a Starbucks, for example, that wanted a drive-through, we wanted to make sure that the underlying zoning would allow that. So you're kind of looking at all these scenarios when you're trying to determine what zoning is appropriate. So as I mentioned, residents' input and the impact on residents is always in the forefront of our decision-making process. And in the case of a B4, keep in mind, zoning goes with the land, not with the developer. So if we rezone this land to B4 and the project falls through, and now we have a B4 zoning district, all of those uses in a B4 would be legally allowed at that site, and there's nothing the residents could do to affect that or to prevent that. So we wanted to come up with a zoning district that is very restrictive, that would allow the office, but wouldn't allow some of those other non-compatible uses that might negatively impact the neighborhood. So what we ultimately recommended, and this has actually even evolved since this proposal, but it was B1, and we proposed a parcel split, and this commercial frontage would be zoned B4. But the problem with B1 is that B1 allowed office, but it didn't allow government service center. So in consultation with the City Planning Commission, as I mentioned, that was our very first stop. We did a pre-app consultation there, and they agreed B1 was going to be the best district to protect the neighborhood and to allow the office use to move forward. And they proposed a text amendment. So as I mentioned earlier, text amendments are very rare. They're most always initiated by the city. And so they added government service center as a permitted use in the B1 district. And then of course, B4 gives the developer, flexibility in what type of businesses can locate here in the future. After meeting with the CPC and figuring out our zoning strategy, we then met with the Planning and Development Department. And keep in mind, Planning is has oversight over the master plan. So our next question was, does this zoning, does it comply with the master plan? The master plan is institutional for this area. So, which is much better. If it was residential, that might be a problem. It might require a master plan amendment, which Sam, you mentioned you saw at City Council recently for the Amazon site. This particular case, the planning department did not like this project. They always envisioned this to be developed with housing. However, because the master plan was institutional, they really did not have any legal authority to make the developer develop housing. If it was city-owned property, they could affect that. If we were going to try to get some tax credits, for example, the city could speak into it. But this is privately owned property, no government money involved, and the master plan supported the rezoning. So we were able to move forward with the support of City Planning Commission and City Council in pursuing the rezoning. So that's an example of where you have these two departments that you kind of have to interact with. And mapping the process would be difficult because if the master plan designation was something different, it would add a whole nother master plan amendment process to this project. The other thing we interacted with the planning department on was screening. The department, PNDD, has the ability to waive or alter the screening requirements. And you can see here these backyards line up to or abut the parking. The zoning ordinance requires parking lots to be screened with a masonry wall set 10 feet off the property line. So if you can imagine, all of these homes already have rear fences. And if we were to build a wall here, it would create this 10-foot dead zone. Who maintains that property? Who mows it? What about trash and dumping? And frankly, it's not safe. So it didn't make a lot of sense for that strict application of the zoning ordinance. Through our community engagement, we learned that the residents don't really want a brick wall. They want some other type of fencing. So we're continuing to work with them to determine what is the most appropriate. And that was one of the things that we met with planning and development about, because they have the authority to approve alternative screening. HRD was not involved because, again, this isn't housing and no incentives. Jet team not involved. The building department, BC, did site plan review. We did submit for that and received a site plan approval letter. The site plan approval letter is very important for funding. A lot of times lenders want to see that site plan approval letter before you can proceed. Any government programs, also funding programs, you need a site plan approval letter. So that's an important milestone. That's something we celebrate when we obtain that. We opted not to go for that PPR in this case because we had so many individual meetings with departments that were very productive. We got feedback early. We chose not to go to a PPR, and there's some political reasons why we didn't go, but in general, PPR is just a tool that we can use. It's not required.
And Tanya, just to make sure I understand, PPR stands for preliminary plan review. What is, yeah, okay.
So that's that service that the Development Resource Center offers, where they would invite representatives from all the various departments to give us preliminary feedback. Another reason why we didn't go to the PPR is that oftentimes the people that we really want feedback from aren't at that meeting. So we don't have any control, for example, who DPW sends. When we might be working with a specific engineer at DPW, and then someone else comes to the PPR, and it could muddy the water depending on the project. So we don't always choose that route if we're far into some of these technical reviews and technical decisions that have been made in consultation with city staff. So, but it is a great resource, the PPR, to not everybody has time to go to each department and kind of get their preliminary feedback. But in this case, we opted not to do that. As mentioned, we did a lot split. That has since been amended. So the lot split is now, we're splitting this into 4 different parcels, I believe. I'm glad Janelle's on the call. She might have to help me answer some questions during Q&A, because she's the project manager for this and more intimately involved in some of the technical details. DPW, some of the concerns about DPW, of course, they had to review the legal descriptions along with the law department. They had concerns about sidewalk replacement surrounding the site, pedestrian access to the site, work in the right-of-way. Keep in mind, this is all one parcel. And there was no city sewer on site or any city roads. These will all be private sewers and private roads. And the question of where to tap in for water and sewer is always a challenge. For example, 2 projects that we worked on in Midtown were well into the pre-development process, and we're told, nope, sorry, you can't tap into that water main. There's not enough water pressure. So that is a big concern with an aging infrastructure in Detroit. This area is not as dilapidated. The underground utilities are not as dilapidated as the central city, but it's always a concern. It's a very important part of due diligence. If you're going to be, in this case, if we were to tap on the major thoroughfare to the south, that is a county road. So DPW wouldn't have any jurisdiction for those permits. That would go to the county. So all of that stuff needs to be coordinated between the departments. I mentioned Detroit Water and Sewer Department, DWSD, in addition to water sewer taps, they have authority over stormwater management. And that is a new requirement in Detroit, a much needed requirement, which requires developers to manage the stormwater on site, either through retention or detention or some type of stormwater or green infrastructure practice that prevents stormwater from over capacity of the existing sewers. So very important consideration. In this case, we kind of allotted here, you can see this is property that they allotted early on in the concept for stormwater. Those have since moved back here is where they're going to do their detention ponds. But in the site planning process, it was accounted for. We consulted with the fire marshal on emergency access. This particular client required secured, gated parking for their employees, separate from their customer parking. So we needed to ensure emergency access, fire lanes surrounding the building. We needed to know if we needed to, or how many fire hydrants we needed to add to the parcel. So those are all considerations. And keep in mind that this site plan development, these technical things are happening as a project is going through the rezoning process. They're on parallel tracks. So you've got the sort of legislative rezoning review happening at the same time that some financing is being sought. And then the community engagement is happening through this entire time. And then these technical land use entitlements. So they're all sort of progressing. And what we do on behalf of our clients is just kind of managing all those moving pieces. And then lastly, let me see. Oh, I just wanted to talk a little bit about community engagement. So the concept plan is something we would develop for some of those preliminary meetings with city officials. For community engagement, we might put together some type of rendering. This is not exactly how the development is going to look, but this gives the residents an idea of context of what's being proposed for their community. And so they can have an idea and a sense of space. This, of course, in the foreground is the retail building. You can see the project has evolved from a one-story office building to, I'm not sure if it looks like it's 3 stories. It's moved up. The retail buildings that which were once 2 retail it's now just 1 retail building. But these are the type of drawings that we would take we've done a number of town hall style meetings. We identified a community organization that's worked with us and given us feedback through the entire development process. And again, I kind of jumped ahead of this slide a little bit. Those are, on the left-hand side, some of the things that we would be looking at as the site plan is developed. So the goal during this phase is to bring the project from that concept plan to a technical site plan that we could submit for site plan review. And so we did that, and we did receive site plan approval from the building department. But as mentioned, the project has changed and we will need to get that site plan approval amended. So some of the other things that residents were able to speak into that doesn't affect the terms of the development is where entranceways, where do you want traffic to come in from? We assumed going in that they would want traffic from the major road here to the south. And however, they complained about traffic accidents and traffic backups and how it's very difficult to turn left at that major intersection. And actually preferred that parking lot entrances be off of some of these side streets. So that's an example of you can't make assumptions when you start a development project, and sort of incorporating community input throughout the process is really important during that site development stage. So the next steps, as I mentioned, we have site plan approval. This project we've been working on for about a year, maybe even longer. And what we determined as the project evolved is that, as I mentioned, one of the office buildings went from 1 story to 3 stories, and it now needs a height variance. The maximum height for this district is going to be exceeded by a few feet. We're going to need some relief from the screening along that residential street. Even though planning development has said, yes, we support this, they believe they have the ability to amend it. As a consultant, we kind of see ourselves as the quarterback for these projects. And my fear is always that, okay, this person said they like our approach, but if they retire or leave, or when we get to the permitting stage and there's amnesia, I would rather have a written variance and a land use decision that states that everybody is comfortable with the fencing and screening that we're proposing. The other thing that triggered it, there's a requirement for interior landscaping. And when it was all one site, we had adequate interior landscaping. But when we divided it up into various parcels, obviously the green space would be all on one parcel, and the other 2, someone could possibly interpret that as deficient landscaping. So that I wanted in our BZA decision spelled out that that is a waiver. We don't want any surprises when we get to the permit stage, which is item 2 on the slide, and when we finalize our construction drawings and submit for electronic plan review. We don't want the zoning reviewers to flag any of those items. We want to be sure that all of our T's are crossed and our I's are dotted, and everybody understands what waivers apply, and there's nothing to cause further delay at that point. Then of course, we hope to pull permits and start construction. They've already started some site clearance. I believe it started last week on this project. So the community is very, very excited. This has been a vacant site for many years, and a lot of dumping has occurred on this site, and they're excited to see this built out. I would like to note also in the future, there's a possibility for some SLU cases, and it's a special land use. As I mentioned, they're conditional land use hearings. And if one of those retail uses would trigger one of those, trigger a hearing, the residents would be notified again for specifically focused on the use. So that wouldn't be a developer responsibility. Generally, in a large development like this, retail spaces or even office spaces are what we call white boxed, where the tenant actually pulls a separate building permit to establish the use and build out the interior. And the developer is just basically bringing mechanical, electrical, and plumbing to the site. They'll do site improvements like parking and site lighting, things like that. But the actual space is a white box. And so that's an important thing to understand as you speak into development. It makes it very hard for residents when they come to these hearings and they want to know what exactly is going into here. It's impossible. No one's going to sign, a retailer is not going to sign a lease for a retail space that might not be built out for 2 more years. And so we have good ideas of what might go in there, but ultimately the market is going to determine that. And anything that could potentially negatively impact the neighborhood, it would trigger that SLU case. So there is some protection there for residents. It's not, you're not giving the developer a clean slate and to do whatever he or she wills on the site. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions regarding the case study, or I'm going to stop my screen share and just turn it back over to Sam and Francis to moderate the discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Tanya. I really appreciate that. So yeah, I think we already have a number of questions lining up in the chat here. I want to remind participants that they're welcome to raise their hand, and Francis or I can call on you. And so this is, I hope everyone can view this as like, this is your time to ask questions about, about the development process or how citizens can engage. Tanya, as a heads up, I know a couple people in the meeting have questions about junkyards, and that's been like a problem use in some of the communities that we've talked to. I want to highlight a question from Pat, her question was, if a use has pulled a permit but has not ever opened and it's currently not maintaining its site, what can be done to erase the use and sort of to address that? And it's just greater context. She added, in Northeast Detroit, there's long established industrial corridors that surround residential neighborhoods. So I think that is a problem that she's facing in her community. And Pat, I know you're a community leader who is well on top of the zoning code, so feel free to chime in if you wanted to add anything further.
Hi, Pat. I knew that question was coming from you because we've worked together for so many years. So it is a very, very good question. There is provision in zoning law to abandon a use. And this goes to, in the beginning of my presentation when I talked about case law, the zoning ordinance used to consider something abandoned after a year. Our zoning ordinance has since been updated to comply with a landmark case, and it was the Livonia Hotel case that said it needed to be vacant for at least 5 years, and the owner had to show what we refer to as an intent to abandon. That is very, very difficult to prove. I've only probably been involved in 3 abandonment cases in my entire career and only won one of them. And what I mean by intent to abandon, I can give you the example the case that we won. It was a liquor store on Livernois, and I was working for the city at the time, and we were trying to shut it down. It had been abandoned, it was an eyesore, and the community hated it. And so we were able, through a lot of research, to find, we have a few real estate brokers on the call, so you guys can appreciate this. We found a real estate broker who had advertised the site for a use other than a liquor store. And there was mention, and then we found a lease agreement who, ironically, I think the defendant presented it on accident to us, and it was the smoking gun that I needed. So that we were able to demonstrate that there was an intent to abandon because it was advertised for use other than a liquor store. So they weren't intending to keep those land use rights. And then the lease that we found in a previous land transaction indicated that the liquor license was not an escrow, but it was transferred to another property elsewhere in the county. So those 2 pieces of evidence allowed us as the city to terminate those land use rights. Very, very difficult, very, very difficult. So at this point, the only recourse you have, if it's not an abandonment case, is just enforcement. And of course, Pat, you know that the city writes tickets, and they go unpaid, or they might pay them and just to keep the property going. Sometimes there's illegal uses on these junkyards, illegal chop shops, and so police enforcement is an option. But from a zoning perspective, because those same rights that protect us as residents, unfortunately, protect bad operators as well. And so there's probably not the answer that you were looking for, but it really is an enforcement issue. The building department is overwhelmed. There's only so many inspectors, and then 144 square miles to inspect and to enforce. And again, the way those are kind of triaged are life safety concerns. So dangerous buildings, anything that is, uses that might be around schools are prioritized by the building department for enforcement. And so that a junkyard may not get regular inspections as the community might hope for. The best way is to try to bring about redevelopment in some way, shape, or form. But we have a lot of people in Detroit that are just kind of land banking these properties, and until someone comes around and offers them an exorbitant amount to develop them.
Great, thanks. There's another question in the chat, but again, I just want to remind people, please feel free to raise your hand. We want this to be a dialogue, and I was actually I was actually texted a couple of questions, which I'm happy if people want to text me questions, but also please feel free to put them in the chat. So I think there was another question about how do you evaluate which corridors can or should be downzoned?
That's a great question. Those types of downzoning efforts are normally initiated by residents, by community organizations. And it would be a similar scenario to what I described in selecting a B1 zoning district for this project. B4 is very permissive. It allows almost everything. And so downzoning a commercial corridor to a B2 is really common, and that would limit the what can be established there. It's also, I caution you, very difficult to attract and do any type of economic development when you downzone, because you're limiting investment potentially as well. So that's something to keep in mind. The two zoning districts that we've done probably the most rezonings for, that's SD1 and SD2. They are relatively new zoning districts, and they facilitate mixed use development on a small scale. They allow for things like maker spaces. So what comes to mind is like the Shinola store in Midtown. That is an SD zoning district. They have a retail component, but they also can make watches and bikes right there on site. Third Man Records, same thing. They have a stamping plant behind the retail component. And so there's a lot more creativity in those SD zoning districts. So I would recommend that be pursued rather than a strict down zoning, because you can still encourage economic development, but have a little more control as to what goes there. Most communities are trying to zone out auto-related uses, car lots, repair shops, things like that. That's generally what we see.
Great. Cool. And I think Nick had his hand raised.
Yeah, quick question. Thank you, Tanya, for that, by the way. That was really awesome. How often can a zone, or how often can an area be rezoned? Is there a limit to that?
No limit at all. The process is not easy. So generally a rezoning is for the purpose of a specific development, and that's more common in Detroit, especially in some of the suburban communities. You'll see people seeking rezonings just to make their property more valuable. An example would be maybe at an interchange where there's an exit. A real estate broker may seek a rezoning to, market that better if the land is for sale. But that doesn't usually happen in Detroit. We don't have those type of parcels. And we're a naturally suspicious bunch in Detroit. I can't even imagine a developer coming and saying, yeah, I want to rezone this parcel, but I have no idea what I'm going to do here or how I want to use it. That just wouldn't fly. That wouldn't fly at all.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Well, I mean, I think, in that same vein, Tanya, that you just mentioned about I think there's a constant tension between a desire to engage communities early, right? But then a developer not knowing exactly what he or she are going to do yet, right? I mean, I think that's a constant tension. And D4, we've had conversations with developers about that tension, because I think organizationally, D4, we want engagement to happen as early as possible, right? I mean, we want communities to be able to get on the ground floor, to be able to shape a project, because ultimately, we think that if you can have that conversation early in the development process, it'll be easier to accommodate community desires than, further down on the line where there's already been money spent on, renderings or architectural design or like whatever. So, I mean, I guess this is just a general question of, how do you think communities and developers can have that conversation early in the process? Yeah, I'll just start there.
Okay. So if I was talking to a group of developers, I would encourage them to ask a lot of questions. So as residents, we want, our opinion matters. Even if they think they know the answer, like we thought we knew what they were going to say about traffic on that particular, on the case study, we ask the question. We also, I would tell developers that not everyone's going to like your project, and you can work with community groups for an entire year and get to city council and they're likely still to come in and oppose your project. So what I like to say is the responsibility of the developer is to make sure everybody in the community understands the proposal. The rumor mill can take on a life of its own. So they're suddenly thinking that you're doing something that it was never even in the cards. So that's very important, and regular communication. They also, we don't want to be blindsided by a project. We don't want to hear about it when we get that public notice 15 days before a public hearing that this major development is going in, you know, right down the street from our home. That's very offensive. So that early engagement, Sam, you're absolutely right, is very important. And so what really all comes down to is respect. And so that is, that's paramount to a successful development. What you can receive input on, you should. And so that's sort of, now take off that hat. Now I'm going to talk to the community organizations. It's equally offensive to make demands on a developer that are just unrealistic. Things that they can't control. What the developer hears is that, look, I'm spending millions of dollars in this community, and you are not respecting or appreciating that fact. Do you want this developed? I mean, I'm just saying this all sounds very harsh, but I've seen it all. I saw early on in my career, there was I'm going to use the Farmer Jack example. I think I told you about this one, Sam. There was a developer that was building out a grocery store, and it was in a community that really needed a grocery store. I mean, you know, back in the days, we still had food deserts, but we really had food deserts back in the early 90s. And the community group was adamantly opposed, and we couldn't get to 10 on it. And the meetings were so unproductive because what they were saying was they wanted a Farmer Jack. They didn't want a no-name grocery store. And they did not like the ethnicity of the operator of the store, and were really taking exceptions. So if I was advising the community group, I would advise them to focus on the land use findings that the city needs to make. Is this going to negatively impact your neighborhood from a traffic perspective? What kind of landscaping do you want? And to focus on the use and not the tenant or the operator. Because again, those land use laws that protect residents also protect developers and ensuring a fair and equitable process. So I never try to convince people to like my clients' projects. Our goal as quarterbacks is just to make sure everybody is armed with accurate information, fully understands the proposal, and that they're listening to each other.
Got it. And this was the question I was texted. What are the noticing requirements? So you just mentioned, you know, the noticing requirements and you know, 15 days or something. I think there's a lot of confusion about what are those requirements? Like when is the community required to hear about these types of projects? And yeah, like, and how do we improve that process?
So the state law requires 15 days public notice, and that in that process, they're required to send notice to all the property owners and tenants within 300 feet of the proposal. They're also required
15 days for a rezoning for like, what triggers that 15-day requirement?
For a special land use hearing, for any zoning proceeding.
Okay.
With a rezoning, there's actually 2 public hearings. So City Planning Commission will have a public hearing. They'll send a notice, And then it'll go from City Planning Commission with a recommendation to City Council. City Council refers it to their Planning and Economic Development Subcommittee, who also hold a public hearing. And that is required per our ordinance for a public notice. The state law doesn't require that second hearing, but our local ordinance requires it. Because remember when I said early on, we have to meet the minimum requirements, but we certainly can go beyond. One of the challenges of extending that public notice is that it's very challenging to for the city to get the notices out and manage their dockets. And there's always such a bottleneck at the city anyway. But keep in mind that every meeting that City Planning Commission and City Council has is a public meeting, even though it's not a formal public hearing. As a public hearing, they're required to take testimony on any agenda item at any time. So if, for example, City Planning Commission normally has 2 meetings for each project at a minimum. So maybe the public hearing happened at the first meeting, and then the second meeting, they're hoping to vote on the project. There's still opportunity to go and ask questions. If enough issues are raised, then City Planning Commission might table it and not vote on it that night and send it back to staff to do more work on the project. So it is a very interactive process. The bare minimum is 15 days. We don't do a great job. The third thing that we're required to do is the city's required to publish it in a newspaper. They use the Detroit Legal News, which nobody reads. So it meets the statutory requirement, but I don't know who's looking at the Detroit Legal News to find out what's going on in their neighborhood. It just doesn't happen. And then the notice to post on site is kind of hit or miss as well. I'm sure you all have seen, if you are out in suburban communities, sometimes you'll see sandwich board signs on a parcel that says this is subject to a public hearing with a phone number or website for more information. Detroit doesn't use those. I'm not sure why. Maybe they get stolen, or maybe it's just too much to manage on such a large scale. But the applicant is required to post public notice on site themselves, and some people do a better job than others. I would hate to rely on just a sign on the property. But in general, residents should know about a project long before it gets to the public hearing stage. In the case of something like a junkyard or a small business that's going to a special land use, they may not.
Great, thanks. Well, I know we only have a few minutes left. Does anybody else have any other questions? Okay, well, I will ask one last question then, Tanya, because this is something that I'm personally confused about, is the site plan review. And you mentioned that it's required, but then it sounds like we, as in the city of Detroit, there's an option for the preliminary plan review, but then there's also a concept review. Does the concept review count as the site review? No, okay.
No, that's a very good question. So back when I was at the city, and I should just preface that, I started my city service at the Board of Zoning Appeals as a zoning inspector back out of college. And I've worked for the Planning and Development Department and Building Safety Engineering Department. So 3 different departments, all 3 of those roles were related to zoning. So site plan review should be a very robust, comprehensive review by all the disciplines. For many years, what site plan review was basically a zoning review. They would review the plans for compliance with the zoning ordinance only. In fact, I remember early on, many years ago, being at a meeting, and I had worked for a time in Illinois where they had a very comprehensive site plan review process. And so I started asking about some civil engineering. To me, site plan review, civil engineering is more important than zoning. When you talk about all those moving pieces, all the requirements that need to be met, your civil set is pretty important. And I had a city planner say, why are you asking questions about the civil set? This is site plan review. And I was very confused by that. But needless to say, in this last iteration on this at the city, we developed a very robust site plan review process that although you apply through the building department, the planning department has the statutory authority to approve or deny a site plan, and all the relative departments speak into it. So the Development Resource Center will determine, hey, there's curb cuts proposed. We want DPW to look at this. And so that's just an example of who might participate. So it's kind of an evolving process, but site plan review is the absolute review. If you do concept plan review, the letter that you might get from there or from a PPR is not the official site plan approval. It's that SPR letter.
Got it. Cool. Well, that is all the time we have today. So I think we'll end on that. I want to thank everyone for attending today and in going with us on the exhilarating ride that is the zoning and approval process. I geek out on it too, so thanks, Tanya, for this. I wanted to remind everyone that our next session is October 28th at the same time at 9 a.m. We also will have sessions on November 11th and November 18th. On the 28th, we'll be really getting into the economics of development and like why does development happen in some neighborhoods versus others. Well, as Francis mentioned, we'll let you know when we post the recording so that you can share it far and wide as you see fit. And if there's nothing else, I think we can adjourn for the day. Yeah, so thank you, everyone. Really, really appreciate it.
All right, great session.
Yep. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you very much. Good information.
Yes, thank you. And we are always available to answer further questions. So you can email us at info@metrodetroitd4.org.
Excellent. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate it.